Good afternoon, all, and welcome to the Plus Lunchtime webinar. My name is Katlego Ramantsima, and I'm your chair and researcher here at the Institute for Poverty, Land, and Agrarian Studies. Today, we will be discussing the contentious Expropriation Bill as an instrument for redress, trying to understand the major concerns about the bill for those in the urban and rural context. Now, submissions for the amendment of the bill were due last week, the 28th of February. The bill is currently in Parliament, and then the National Council of Parliament. Then the final step will be its ratification by the President. There are concerns that have been raised by different sectors of the society. Some are concerns in relation to the provisions in the bill, and also the neglect of key questions on equitable access to land and social justice, such as who should benefit from the expropriated land, gender equity, and ensuring transparency in land delivery processes. Joining us today is Shakira Kwabe, an activist at the Tshwane Leadership Foundation, Bonani Loliwe, an activist and head of administration at Vulamasango in the Eastern Cape. Now, we've made a very big mistake by writing that Bonani is a director at Vulamasango. But he clarified that there is no director at Vulamasango, but he's just the head of administration. We're also joined by Michael Clark, who is an activist and researcher at Ndifunukwazi here in the Western Cape. Please do not forget to tweet about the conversation on Twitter, and the Twitter handle is the Expropriation Bill and hashtag spatial justice, as demonstrated on the bottom of your screens. Now, Michael, usually when we talk about the Expropriation Bill, at times we lack, a thorough understanding of what the bill is and what it entails. Can you please take us through what is actually in the bill? What are the main changes proposed to be made in the bill, and what are sort of like the specific concerns for those in the urban context?
Thanks so much. Yes, the bill, before we can talk about whether or not the bill will advance spatial justice and land reform, we really have to reflect on what expropriation is, what the bill specifically provides for, and how it fits into urban land justice. And so that's really what I wanted to focus on today. Firstly, just some contextualizing comments. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, according to Stats SA, and that inequality really follows gender, racial, spatial lines. A large part of this is because of the skewed system and patterns of ownership that exists in South Africa and our exclusionary housing markets. And of course, a lot of this has its origin in apartheid and colonial spatial planning. But these things have also been worsened with existing government policies and also with various other issues like exclusionary land and property markets. So the effect has been in the rural context that the vast majority of poor and working class people end up being excluded from accessing affordable, well-located housing in urban areas and in urban centers, and are specifically kind of pushed towards the side, towards the urban periphery, where they struggle to access opportunities and social amenities. And so we know that COVID-19 pandemic has also worsened this and actually exacerbated all of these inequalities, and that there's a unique spatial element to that as well. So people who live in peri-urban areas are twice as likely to have lost their job because of COVID, according to the NIDS CRAM study. And that a lot of people that live in townships and informal settlements have definitely been more affected by this than people, for example, living in the suburbs. And so knowing that this has happened and that these are big issues that have been facing us, the question really arises about why we haven't really been able to address this in the 27 years since the end of apartheid. And that's a little bit more of a complex question and a little bit more of a complex answer. We know that we've had a constitution, we've had land reform that's specifically provided for in section 25.5 to 25.9 of the constitution. Those are incredibly progressive measures that also allow the state to expropriate land for public purpose or in the public interest, and specifically for land reform purposes. We have in that section of the Constitution, section 25.3, we specifically have provisions that say that just and equitable compensation for expropriation only has to include market value as one of the factors, including a host of other factors. And so we know that in terms of our existing constitutional framework, there was a possibility for expropriation to really be used as a proactive tool to address land reform if the state had wanted to do so. We know that there's existing legislation that provides for the possibility of expropriation. The Expropriation Act was one of them. The Housing Act, Section 9 of the Housing Act specifically provides for the possibility for municipalities to expropriate land for the development of state subsidized housing. And we know that the Land Reform Labor Tenants Act also allows for the state to expropriate land for the purposes of providing land for labor tenants. We also know that the state owns a lot of its own land. We know that at all of the different levels of government, the state owns land, has land at its behest, and that it could actually release this land or use this to promote spatial transformation and land reform. So the question really comes down to what has happened in the last 27 years that means that this hasn't happened in effect? And why is it so important for us to put so much emphasis on the Expropriation Bill itself? And this is where I want to turn first towards the Expropriation Bill itself. So let's unpack what the bill itself says and what the bill itself actually intends to do. So the bill provides for the possibility of the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, and specifically the minister, to expropriate property for public purpose or in the public interest. It's important to mention that other organs of state, so other state entities, can also approach the minister and advocate for why certain pieces of property should be expropriated. And if they convince her, then she is obliged to also expropriate those pieces, that property. What's important is that the bill doesn't only apply to land and the expropriation of land. Rather, it applies to expropriation of all property. And that's important because the bill is actually a very general bill, and it's a bill that allows for expropriation in many different contexts. And that is that's not really anything new. We've had an expropriation bill in South Africa before. Many other countries across the world have expropriation bills, and expropriation is often used as a tool to allow governments to perform the functions that they need to perform. For example, if they need to build a railway track, they might need to expropriate certain pieces of land. And so in that sense, the expropriation bill doesn't really add that much new. In fact, one of the places and one of the big concerns that I think a lot of people have with the bill is the fact that it doesn't really specify how to address the issue of what is just an equitable compensation in cases where property is being expropriated and compensation is still being paid. So the main difference that this bill specifically provides for is the possibility that some pieces of land could be expropriated without compensation. But in all other circumstances, expropriation is still subject to just and equitable compensation. And what this bill does in clause 12.1 is that it simply reiterates what the Constitution already says. So section 25.3 of the Constitution says that if a court or if a state entity decides on how much compensation to pay for an expropriation of property, that there are a number of factors that need to be considered, and that there needs to be an equitable balance that is reached between the interests of society and the interests of the property owner. And these factors include 5 different factors, and one of them, just one of them, is market value. And so that's important to remember, that the Constitution and now the Expropriation Bill specifically provide that market value is simply one of 5 different factors, including factors like the history of the property, how it was obtained or how somebody acquired that property, what the purpose of the expropriation is. So, for example, if the purpose is land reform purposes, then maybe potentially very little compensation has to be paid, those kinds of circumstances. As I said, the main issue here is that the state hasn't really clarified in this bill how to weigh up those factors in cases where expropriation is still subject to compensation. And that's deeply concerning, because if state officials don't know how to actually weigh up those different factors and what those factors mean in practice, they're going to struggle to, in practice, decide how much compensation they need to offer in certain circumstances. It also might have the potential of actually creating more uncertainty rather than addressing the uncertainty that people already have about the bill and about its impact. And lastly, it might also delay further processes as we wait for ministers to implement regulations or provide guidance as to how that would go ahead. The main and most important aspect and the biggest change that the bill brings about, of course, is that in certain very circumscribed situations, land may be expropriated without compensation. And this is listed in section 12.3, clause 12.3 of the bill. And it is specifically limited to spaces where people are holding land for speculation. In other words, they're holding onto that land not to use it for some productive purpose, but rather holding it simply so that it accrues in market value and so that they can sell it later on at a higher price. Situations where land has been abandoned by owners, where the land value is lower than the state investment in that land, and circumstances where land is owned by a state entity but is not used by that state entity for its core functions. And that's really, really important and powerful, and it has the potential to be a game changer. 2 big concerns that we have with the bill and that I think are important to reflect on is that the bill does not provide any guidance on who the beneficiaries will be of this bill, and that there are serious concerns about the state's capacity to be able to fulfill its obligations in terms of this, the bill. We know from land reform processes and from the very extreme burden that those processes have placed on the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, that there really is a need to be able to provide sufficient human capacity, time, resources, and funding for these processes. Otherwise, they're simply a pipe dream. And lastly, something that I think is incredibly important is just the fact that we really require the state to genuinely prioritize and commit to this process of land reform and spatial transformation. In particular here, the lack of political will has been a main stumbling block, and addressing that will really be the thing that really changes things with this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. My next question goes to Bonani, right? One could say that the debate about land expropriation is out of date, and others have had like various views of saying that there is no need for an expropriation bill. Some have said that it is necessary and so forth. And Michael has also, shared with us the urban concerns regarding the bill in itself. What is the reason for us to have a discussion about the expropriation bill in South Africa today, besides the fact that it's a bill that we needed to make submissions for. But what is the importance of having these discussions today?
Good afternoon to all who are listening and also to the other panelists. Firstly, let me respond by saying South Africa, since all of us know, during the imperial period, which was when we were being colonized to apartheid, most South Africans who were Black and Africans were forced to live at less than 15% at the moment land in South Africa, which is part of what caused some kind of struggle that took place to liberate South Africa. It's important, therefore, that when we look today into South Africa, we look South Africa in two ways. We see the first world South Africa, which is a first world comprised of an elite who's legally registered, with services, with title deeds, with better security compared to the third world that South Africa finds itself in, which is a third world which is characterized by poverty, unemployment, desperation, landlessness. The third world where most inhuman activities of this world normally is at times a culture known in order to survive. Now, since 1994, in fact, prior 1994, the dream that South Africa thought it will be is that the land will be, as it says, shared among those who are working it. And therefore, proportionally to that argument, one will expect after 27 years that South Africa, Black in particular, will have a better share of land ownership. But unfortunately, up until to date, such has not taken place. If it has taken place, it has taken place to a certain small number of people, especially those that are connected and associated with those in power. But those that, because of all cruel activities of the past, find themselves in what is called rural societies. And those that, because they still want to get some jobs, come closer to town, they have nothing. Nothing has changed for them. If you go to East London, just less than a kilometer from East London, if you fly into Joburg or Cape Town airport, you will see that since 1994, those informal settlements remains a sort of story. Now, it begs one to look into this bill in that context, to look into this bill and ask a real question, that are the rights of what it is termed in this bill as unregistered, are they really protected? And the answer is no. They will only be protected if they are contested in court. And I will come back to that, because I normally have a problem with access to justice that the very low people in the third world. For them to get justice, they need someone to talk on their behalf, like angels, foundations, you name them. To them, to go and get justice, they need someone to tell them that their right is violated and these are entities that can assist them. And many a times, some of them died slowly. Mampanyaza outside Kumuka was born in a farm, and the white men left the farm. The state last year sent someone to live with Mampanyaza without Mampanyaza's consent. Recently, we learned about Pluto. was to be evicted in the farm that was given to him by the state, with evidence of working the land. So such people, this bill has not protected them. They are the most dispossessed people. The consequences of dispossession can be easily be seen. They are most vulnerable. The bill has given power to the minister as an authority for expropriation. In fact, as the previous bill has already said, municipalities can. What worries me is the capacity of the state. The state has failed dismally, in fact, to use the actual constitution provision on expropriation. Since our democracy, there is not a single case where the state has attempted to say we've tried to expropriate. They, on a daily basis, when they talk about development, target this group. Olobeni case is a typical case of this. When they said that doing this based on the public interest. The people of Ngcecha, just along the coast of East London, out of East London, were seconded to a traditional leader, and the title deed is of that traditional leader. She's using the land for no benefit to the community except job creation, which is not even a true job creation as it was said before. So these are the issues that one raises to say if there is a provision about the court, there is an argument within the bill that says there are other legislation that will be used. So in other words, there will be alignment. The past 20 years in rural spaces and informal settlement proved beyond reasonable doubt that law to them, to those that are in that space, is far to protect them, unless somebody else come on a mercy grounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonani, for those very important inputs. Now, please join in the conversation. Just a reminder, and our Twitter handle is #Expropriation Bill, Spatial Justice. Also, please, you can send through your comments and also your questions for the panel before us. So my next question goes to Shakira. Shakira, the Tshwane Leadership Foundation is an inner city community organization that is committed to socially inclusive urban transformation. What are your concerns around the city of Tshwane with regards to this expropriation bill? Does the bill address expropriation for public interest in terms of who should actually come first for the use of land?
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. It's 2021, and one would be forgiven for thinking that the government is oblivious to the spatial apartheid that is ever present in our cities. But the truth of the matter is that they're not. Both national and local policies, laws, etc., actually acknowledge the dispossession of land that took place through apartheid and colonialism, and how it's imperative for the government to address this as part of spatial justice. An example is the city of Tshwane's policy called Tshwane 2055, where the government explicitly says that they would like to see spatial apartheid eradicated from the city of Tshwane by the year 2055. But nowhere is spatial injustice and land dispossession more stark than in the economic hubs of this country, such as the Western Cape and Gauteng. In these places, well-located prime land is usually used for speculation and market transactions. This is not only a land issue, but it extends to properties as well, which are well-located and not in use. We feel that the bill is actually quite ambiguous when it comes to expropriation of this prime land and property, especially when it belongs to the municipality or the state. How they would rather actually auction off these to raise revenue than actually using them to to address special injustices, such as they are doing in Tshwane concerning Woodland Village, or otherwise known as Plastic View, a community that is located in the eastern suburbs of the city, to a point where the city of Tshwane started auctioning off parcels of land around this informal settlement in order to raise revenues, because lawyers for human rights put a stop to them auctioning off the land this informal community was on. Or even reclaim the city's fight with the Cape Town municipality concerning the Sisigu house. And then there's Salvogop, which is a community that has existed since the early 90s. And now they're in danger of actually getting displaced, so that the Department of Public Works can come in and build a government precinct. A precinct basically to build government headquarters in one place, because it's close to the highway, close to the Gautrain station, and 15 minutes away from the union buildings. But now it begs the question, when you have Section 25, Chapter 3 of this bill, basically outlining how government entities, how government departments can approach the expropriating authority to ask them to expropriate on their behalf, and then providing a step-by-step on how this can take place, right down to who can foot the bill. But no such courtesy is extended to communities, to people, to movements who may also need land, especially state land that is in abundance. If you don't believe me, look at how much land is owned by the Department of Public Works, how much land is owned by the South African National Defence Force. This is the land that we can start to address special apartheid. It's available, it's there, but it's not being used. And if people occupy this land, they get violently removed and displaced. The Expropriation Bill actually has a chance to lend credence to the fight for social and economic inclusion for the majority of people who were displaced from their land and then put on the peripheries of these metropolitan areas. These are the very real repercussions of having an expropriation and land reform bill that is underutilized, that is ambiguous when it comes to normal people and how they can access land, and that is not at all moving towards solving the long-standing issues of spatial injustice in this country. Thank you.
Shakira, for that. Now, I see that there aren't any questions as yet. So I will ask Bonani. Bonani, you spoke about access to justice and that it's quite problematic. Can you further talk about that? And why is and why is the authority to expropriate given to the minister questionable? Bonani?
Hello.
Yes.
Let me explain first that for anyone that has to go to court, one needs to have some kind of fund available to do so, especially on issues of property which have value. Think about it, if people of Kolobeni happens to have their own money, they will never went and get services of the non-sector organization to finance their own legal battle. The state, with all resources it has continued to frustrate them over all these years. If you can look at the story about Abahlali Basemejo in Durban, one will argue that without the support of non-sector, those people will not be where they are, protected. So it is expensive exercise for anyone who is poor to get justice in South Africa. The second issue which you are raising, which is important, we have to take stock of what happened in this country. When the minister is empowered to protect lands which will have applied for restitution. One in Timbaza, Aroa along Baza was taken by an elite, and they created their own community at the expense of the rural masses who are using that land for livelihood. The minister failed to actually take into action a decision of a Biso court, and you still put a trust into a person called a minister. I argue here that land expropriation in South Africa is needed, of course, but we need really an institution that will drive that. After this institution in South Africa have proven over the past years that they are efficient than the Department of the State, especially when it comes to human rights issues. And I want you to support that, of course, in order for us to realize land expropriation, which is needed, we need to make sure that land expropriation is taking place in Africa. And Ruth Hall put it very, very nicely when he wrote an article on the 11th of February. The problem is not to expropriate, but rather of the citizens to hold the state as to why the state has failed. Just to add on that, how the state has failed to realize our own objective as South Africa in terms of the struggle that we had. Why the land is still in the hands of the white and big companies. In fact, those big companies, some of them are owned by the very same white commercial farmers and other white people in big businesses. Why? After 27 years. It's important that we make sure that we make the state to account. So let's support the bill, but try as much as we can to make sure that this bill works and the law protects those that are vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonani. Please drop your questions in for the panel. There's a question, yes, from Gabriel Tati, and this is to Michael. He asked how to remove the uncertainties over the potential outcomes of the bill.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, because I think
Sure.
Gabriel addressed it directly to you.
Sure. Sure. So one of the big, I think one of the big concerns that both myself and Bonani have raised now multiple times is that the fact is that the state has had these mechanisms and these abilities to be able to facilitate land reform, and it has a range of tools. Expropriation is only one of them, and expropriation has already existed. And one of the big concerns is that the state has failed to use those mechanisms consistently. And we're talking about the state at all levels. We're talking about everyone from the Department of Public Works, which has the power to transfer certain types of land at this point in time from one entity to another. We're talking all the way to municipalities like the municipality of Cape Town. In fact, in some cases, the state has actively resisted those powers to expropriate. Like, for example, in the case of the Marikana informal settlement, and where the city of Cape Town was specifically ordered by the court to expropriate that land so that people wouldn't be displaced. And the city has just consistently tried to resist that order. And so I think one of the big concerns here is that we need this bill to be very clear and to not lead to any further delays or any further contestation and uncertainty. And that's the one part where I think that the bill could have been strengthened a little bit more. As I said, the bill has the potential to be a game changer, but it needs multiple things. It needs the political will from the state to be able to be committed to achieving spatial transformation and land reform. It needs the resources, human capacity, all of those things, and it needs clarity. We need the clarity to be able to facilitate and not further delay these things. And at the moment, other than specifically providing for the instances where land can be expropriated without compensation, there isn't that clear clarity that is needed in the bill.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Susana Coleman. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. And she asked, how do we motivate for a particular expropriation to the minister? How do we propose appropriate expropriations? And what obligation has the minister got to respond to these sorts of requests? I think this is a question for everyone. Anybody wants to take a shot?
Let me start. I do not know whether I will be answering her, Susan, sufficiently. How to motivate a particular expropriation to the minister? Any expropriation will address one of the key deficiencies that the past has done in South Africa, will be to expropriate land so that there is equality in terms of land ownership in South Africa. If we miss that, and we use expropriation as a way of looking to other, as already hinted, that expropriation is not only limited in this regard into land, but other properties that people might have. Really, we need to discuss that, because what does it mean if we talk about pensions that have been in investment for quite some time? Will, if a need arises, those funds be exploited? We haven't checked, because all of us focus on one area. And I think if what I will say to answer Susan from where I stand is that the only purpose at the moment, and across histories of the world where expropriation has been done, expropriation was used to address the question of inequality. But I also want to respond to one of the questions, which I do not know whether I'm allowed to do so. As I've said, the bill tenure rights of farm workers, farmland occupiers. At the moment, there is protection of them in the bill. The protection of them in the bill. Instead, the bill talks about if such rights are to be impacted or the expropriation required will affect them, compensation will be the way to them, nothing else. And those that are vulnerable, farm dwellers, farm workers, are not protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonani, for that answer. I hope, Susana, it did answer your question. Our next question will be from Zasa. I'm so sorry if I pronounced it wrong. And it's directed to you, Michael. The question is, you say that clause 12.1 would have benefited from greater clarity on how compensation should be determined. Should that not be a compensation policy, as Ruth Hall argues?
Well, it's very hard to argue with a very clever Ruth Hall. I think that she has very great points, always. For me, I think that clarity is necessary, and I'll explain why. The first reason, I think, is simply because at this point in time, after the extent and length of time that we've spent debating expropriation, the change in the Constitution, the Expropriation Bill, it's been years. People are fed up of talking. People want to see action. They want to see actual implementation. They want to see how expropriation has the potential to actually be utilized for land reform and spatial justice. And the reality is that waiting for another policy to be implemented has the potential to further delay those issues. The other thing is that legislation is created in Parliament. It's created through a lot of discussion, public participation. It's subject to all of these very strong determinations and powers. And it's almost like a sense of like the state's power, right? The state is obliged in terms of Section 25 to take reasonable legislative and other measures to facilitate land reform. And so there we have a space where it's very clear that this is partly Parliament's responsibility, and that it gives us potentially a greater opportunity to really participate in these processes if this is very clearly laid out in the bill itself. This doesn't say that it shouldn't be in regulations. It should potentially be dealt with in regulations. It should potentially be dealt with in policy. But I think that at this point in time, I think the majority of South Africans would have wanted us to be further down the line. They would have wanted us to have more clarity at this point in time. I also just maybe want to touch on the question that Bonani answered about farmland. The bill specifically does provide for some protection to people who are who are termed unregistered rights holders in land. Okay, and the definition of unregistered rights holders in land is actually very broad. It includes anyone who has a legal right to land or legal right over land that is being expropriated, but it also includes anyone who has protection in terms of the law. And so there's a very big possibility that that could actually refer to farm workers and farm dwellers, as well as people with customary land rights and even potentially unlawful occupiers. I mean, that's potentially debatable and we could still discuss it, but there is a possibility that it could extend to those people. And I agree with what Bonani was saying, that unfortunately the bill doesn't go far enough to protect those people. There is, all of those protections are dependent on the owner. So the owner needs to notify people who people are that have unregistered land rights in that property. And I don't think that the requirements for proof are really open enough and facilitate enough space for people to really come forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question is from Pilan Samchia, and he raises a very interesting question here. He says, can you explain the difference between expropriation and confiscation? The media is using these terms interchangeably, or is there a bigger politics in the words? Anybody who'd like to give it a shot?
Okay.
If you wouldn't, Bonani, please go, Bonani.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Expropriation is a process of taking one's asset, which is property. In terms of the law, I want to put it in a very simple way. In terms of the law, for the purposes of a public good, that land expropriation we're talking about. To confiscate is to take somebody's property with force. So the difference here is that one is true law and the other one true wrong law, if I may put it that way. The apartheid as government happened to have laws those against you. That was a force. Our land was confiscated because there was no chance for us to negotiate as majority in this country. So media will use whatever it wants, especially to show that the campaign against the expropriation in South Africa is something new after 1994. Was the 1975 Act was used against the same white South Africa to leave some of the lands that were needed for consolidation of the homelands. So it is a force. The other one is true, a process of law for the purpose of public good. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to add to that?
I would like to add, just to maybe add specifically that confiscation usually happens in situations where there's been a criminal act. So usually what that means is it's somebody who has something that is illegal, like, I don't know, like they've committed a crime, for example, they've sped or something, and something happens in response to that in relation to their property. For example, the one place where confiscation happens is with informal traders, where if informal traders are not allowed to trade in a specific place and they've been warned multiple times and they've been issued with fines and they haven't paid those fines, then sometimes the next step would be to confiscate their property. The system is not comparable to expropriation at all. Like expropriation is a government-sanctioned process, as Bonani said, that is detailed. It provides more than sufficient protection, including in this bill, in the expropriation bill, there is a lot of space to negotiate, to make offers and counter offers, a lot of space to really there's even space for mediation. And even if mediation doesn't happen, then that goes directly to a court. And even owners or unregistered land rights holders who feel aggrieved by what the state is doing can insist that the state actually takes the matter to court in relation to dealing with compensation. So there's a lot of protection here for people, and for people to equate the two is simply disingenuous, and it's about stoking fears, to be honest. And so, yeah, I do feel like that's disingenuous to compare those two.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. Our next question goes to Shakira, and Kanyiso Gumede is asking this question. He asks, what has been the reasons laid by municipalities for not expropriating for housing? Government has raised absence of law for not expropriating for land reform. Municipalities have the law, why not?
One is pretty simple. If you look at urban municipalities, all land is usually used for speculation. It is one of the biggest source of revenues for municipalities, especially prime land. So for them to use that kind of land in order to fix the injustices of the past, it is not the top option. They would rather put that land towards other users to generate revenue than to actually address injustices of the past with that land. For them, expropriation in housing is like the last thing on their minds. It's not the first thing on their minds. They want to use the land for speculation.
Thank you very much, Shakira, for that. Our next question is from Simon Hull, and he asks, does the bill sufficiently safeguard the dignity of South Africans? That is, could expropriation in terms of the bill lead to further violations of dignity? I think that's a very important question, as I think all three of you emphasize this word protection throughout your presentations. Is there anybody who would like to give that a shot?
I'm happy to come in. I think that the bill has a lot of potential. It has the potential to really start accelerating land reform. As I said, those instances where land is allowed to be expropriated without compensation are part of the problems, part of the real challenges for why we haven't seen land reform happening. But the other part is that there needs to be political will. And so that is the bottom line here at this point in time. And the reality is that if there is, just like any piece of legislation, laws could have unintended consequences or could further jeopardize certain rights. In this case, it could be more, or would be more likely to be people with unregistered land rights which I'm particularly concerned about. I feel that some of those protections that have been put in place, as I've said, are all dependent on particularly on owners communicating. So unscrupulous owners would be able to, I think, get away with a lot. And that has the additional problem that those people might already be vulnerable. And so there is the possibility that that would affect them as well. But also from a purely like the objective of the bill, which is aimed at specifically trying to address spatial transformation and land reform, there's a concern that beneficiaries haven't been included in this bill at all. They haven't specifically been referred to. There's no indication of how the bill specifically links up to land reform legislation that exists. And in that sense, there are also concerns about dignity, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for that answer. We only have 10 minutes, so I will quickly go through all possible questions. So our next question is from Jan de Lange, and he asks, the Motlanthe High Level Panel identified corruption and incompetent civil servants as the real stumbling blocks for land reform. Is this a good time to grant civil servants more powers over property? Well, Bonani? Yes.
Can I start?
Sure.
Yes. I think this is a known factor as Jan has indicated. I mean, it's part of the report of Motlanthe. One of the recent departed DG of Agriculture that there is a problem of capacity within the department. Besides corruption and there is a huge, very huge incapacity in the department. Very huge. If you look in terms of land restitution, as we speak in the Department of Rural Development, and you look public works in terms of public assets that are under them, and how some of those assets were supposed to be good, they were not used, tells you a lot about the state machinery in terms of taking this bill, which is crucial. It's a crucial bill because it's a bill that tried to redress the imbalance of the past. So that is why my main concern was why it is given to a minister than an institution which will look to it as a human right matter. It's a question of a human right that needs to be addressed. And I do believe, which is what I thought, that there is no intention of the current administration to realize the Motlanthe panel reports. To me, they have taken a step to recognize the presidential panel reports and leave this behind, because that one, the presidential one, has a sense of accommodating the interests of the business and the elite in South Africa than to change the status quo of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to add to that very important question? I know that a lot of us have concerns around who should be given the authority to expropriate. Shakira, do you want to give it a shot also? What are your views? Do you think that the minister is the appropriate candidate to be expropriating, or should the powers be given to someone else in authority, like the president or the people, or yeah?
I think so far, even with the expropriation bill having existed for so long, we have witnessed the lack of political will to really put it into effect. And then you have a minister being given the powers to act as the expropriation authority. How sure are we, when we are already not covered by the bill, that the bill would truly address the injustices of the past if the minister is the one who is the expropriating authority? It will be better if I think that is given to maybe an institution that is very much aware of the human rights issue at play with this current status quo of land dispossession, and will do something to make sure that the process moves as fast as possible and not be stalled any further than it has.
All right. Thank you very much, Shakira, for that answer. Our next question is from John Dini. And he's also asking a very important question, because often when we talk about, land reform or land issues, we sometimes get to forget that there are issues around water rights. So John Dini basically asks us, could this bill also apply to other forms of property, such as apartheid era water rights that have resisted the intent in the National Water Act to bring about more equitable reallocation?
So if I could weigh in there, the bill at the moment does primarily, it provides for expropriation of property. So it doesn't specify what form that property specifically is. One of the things that it says is that it provides for the expropriation of property if it is in the public interest or for a public purpose. And when we're talking about the definitions of public interest and public purpose, there is a very clear idea there that it's about land reform is included as one of those options, and more equitable distribution of natural resources is also included in that. Now, natural resources is not specifically defined in the bill, but I would imagine that things like water rights allocations would specifically fall into that. However, it's important to know that the new section that talks about expropriation without compensation only applies to land. So that means that where expropriation of other property rights or other rights of property or other types of property happen, that would still be subject to just an equitable compensation being paid.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question in the 3 minutes that we have is from Andries de Toit, and he is asking, will this speed up land reform? What is the risk of redistribution projects being locked up in long, complicated legal disputes? Bonani, do you want to take that question?
I will. In fact, I was noted it already. I think Andrews, and it's important that we know first that we have a state which is not willing to realize the objectives of land reform in South Africa. The state is not willing. And if Ruth Hall's call that the power now remains with the people to make sure that land expropriations happen, that should be the only way. It is deliberate sometimes by the state, in my view, to create some kind of chaos in order to dodge whatever one wants to see as the realization of land reform. And I therefore want to submit that, of course, we are already logged in court dispute on land restitution in many issues, which is something deliberately done through by the state. The only thing that is needed is a clear revolution from the ground. The people should try by all means to make sure that this was not as a result of a campaign of election, but a real issue that needs the society to address. The unfortunate part is that even though this bill is out, you don't find the very same noise about it from political parties, and which surprises me. The only parties that will find coming into the bill, it will be the DA that will represent the interests of the white commercial farmers, nothing else. And they will use as much as they can to use media so that they give us a misinformation. in terms of the real vision of the land expropriation. So to me, to answer that question, it can speedily assist in addressing the land reform in South Africa if it is carried in a manner that is democratic, transparent to societies, and also make sure within its own application that those that are going to benefit, as my fellow panelists have already alluded, are clearly been defined in terms of our agenda for transformation of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonani. And now we will end with Jan de Lange's question here. And I guess this question basically goes to everyone. So I'd really appreciate it if everybody gave it a shot. So he asked, is it the highly politicized debate about expropriation hiding the real issues of land reform? So Shakira, do you want to go for it first?
I think the only real issue it's hiding about land reform is the lack of movement happening there. That's the real thing it's hiding. But otherwise, no, it's not hiding anything. I think the debates are absolutely necessary to be had so that the next expropriation bill we have absolutely covers all the bases and especially covers the people who've been dispossessed for the longest time. And we do away with the status quo as we've had for the last 27 years, where there was no expropriation. That was meaningful. That happened to address the special apartheid that we have.
Michael?
Sure. I think that's kind of spot on. I do think that there is a lot that is hidden with the politicized debates, or not hidden, but things that are overlooked. The reality is that a lot of this is politicking. It is politicians that have, for the longest time, used the Constitution and the lack of law as an excuse, and now they are not able to do that anymore. And so what this is going to really require to genuinely accelerate land reform will be that political will, which is the main point that I just want to get back to. Unless this is well funded, unless the department has the capacity, the political leadership, the competent management, the sufficient capacity and resources that it needs to be able to do this. And there is a firm commitment from all stakeholders in government to really genuinely do this. It's just going to be empty rhetoric. And that's the risk that these debates also run. And so for that reason, I would say it does hide the fact that this is about land reform and that we actually need to get back to those basics.
Bonani?
Well, I think my last submission within a minute is that although I've been praying throughout that the people themselves must try to make sure that really they use their power to make sure that this bill, when it is an act, realize their ambition of seeing that there is equality in South Africa. But they haven't said so. The space itself, in terms of the people on the ground, is so polluted. Our people over the past 7 years have been made to depend on the state. So even in terms of saying this bill will be realized, a lot within societies or communities will not want to stand up for what is for them, which is expropriation bill. Once it's an act, it will assist to change the ownership. And in a way, if it is made well, realize some of the dreams to alleviate poverty and create small-scale farming, which is the way to go in the developing world, than the small-scale farmers, which the other group within South Africa wants to protect. A legacy that they know have deprived many Black South Africans their own dignity. Land on its own, to us, has a many definitions and meanings as Black South Africans. So how do you then want to remain with people that have been for quite some time crying over of what was taken from them. It's a way to go. Let's engage. Let's make sure that we understand that this process, which is this bill, is a very separate process from the review of the Section 25. So the energy that we have should not stop when this was made, these submissions are finalized on Sunday. But we have to continue engaging and see that the state is forced to realize some of the legislations that should give certain protections which are left out in this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. And we thank also our viewers. Thank you for your comments and your questions. Unfortunately, due to time, not all of them could be addressed in this session. I mean, we could go on and on discussing this very important bill and more. As Michael said earlier on to me, it could take us days and even months just discussing this bill. Thank you, everybody. Please do join us next week as we will be discussing women's lands rights at the same time, 1 p.m. Central African time. Thank you and goodbye.